It's a great pleasure to have Huki Shaw with us today. Huki is Beaver Shaw's brother, so that should be interesting in itself. I think Huki was a bit young to participate in the war, but I thought it would be really interesting for us to get the perspective of a young Rhodesian guy growing up during the war and having family, brothers, and whatever fighting in the war. And so, although Huki himself wasn't a fighting man of Rhodesia, he was nevertheless part of our tribe and part of the whole experience. Would you say that's an accurate introduction, Huki?
Yeah, that's a very accurate introduction for my generation. I was very young, not too young. I did sign up for registration. I can remember the day that we all had to go down to the headmaster's office and get our national registration stuff done. I think when we turned 16, we all had to queue up. All the boys had to queue up and do that. I grew up in a family that is a couple of generation Rhodesian. Our family moved up there and settled. A lot of the Shores families settled around Samabulla and Lower Gwelo and farmed there. In fact, there's a group of African people from Grahamstown and that area, the Fingoos, who are also a small, very small part of a tribe of people that were ousted and they were allowed to settle around Grahamstown by the tribe that was there. When my family moved up to Rhodesia by Oxwagon, those people all went with my family, and a lot of them worked with the family and all the farms, and a lot of those families lost their accommodation and places to live when those farms were annexed. There were five of us boys, my mum and dad. Dad was in the veterinary department. My mum was born in South Africa and met my dad and came up and lived with her. Dad originally joined the Rhodesia Railways, but mum was unhappy with the railways. They ended up getting a job in the veterinary department, which probably influenced myself and my four other brothers quite greatly, and particularly Beaver and myself and my other brothers, because of the background. We all spent a lot of time in the southeastern Lowveld with my dad. Dad was in the veterinary department, so we visited lots of farms. He looked after controlling foot and mouth and rabies. So our school holidays, we all took turns. My oldest brother, Owen, who ended up becoming a customs officer with Rhodesia Customs, and he did his national service in Rhodesia and then branched across to being a sapper in engineers. And when he came back from his basic training, the first thing he did was grab a whole lot of military stuff. We had some leggings and he painted them white, got my old scout belt, painted it white, grabbed my old man's beret and promptly stuck me in the backyard and marched me up and down and put me on parade. So that tended to happen with all my brothers. When Beaver came back from joining the Air Force, he sort of chucked all his combat kit on me one day and dragged me around the backyard. So all of us rhodey kids of my generation were, what the Aussies call bowerbirds, or we collected. And I still struggle when I see Rhodesian memorabilia, and there's a story about the stuff you can see behind me, which is a testament to that. We used to hang around the Forces Canteen in Fort Vic and hound the troopies and soldiers for any bit of memorabilia or camo that they could give us.
Sorry, can I interrupt you while I'm thinking about it? So your old man was in the veterinary department.
Yes.
Did you ever meet Dr. John Condi, who was, I believe, also in the veterinary department?
I know the name.
I think he was head of the...
Dad would have met him.
Yeah, he was head of the veterinary department. He did his PhD, or became a fellow of the Royal College of Veterinary Surgeons, FRCVS, and did his thesis on foot and mouth disease in Rhodesia. And his son, Dave Condi, and Mike Condi, and Kathy Condi, Dave Condi and I were both at Plumtree School together for a while, and I just wondered if you knew the Condis. They were quite famous. You might remember they had a house in Rolfe Valley there near Chisapiti, and they had they brought up a baby rhino in their lounge, in their garden. They had a baby rhino. Yeah, and that was used to feature in the Rhodesia Herald quite a lot, the pictures of the rhino in the middle of Salisbury. But anyway, I'm sorry I interrupted you. Please
No,
carry on.
no, it then branches off to, you've triggered some memories. So some of my very early memories when I was very young, one of the first trips I went away on my own, we camped on the banks of the Yamani River, Devurley Ranch, I think it was, just across the Tarugwe River. And the country there was typically very old school Africa, almost like the stuff you'd see in the old books. And as a kid, I read every single book on great white hunters. There were every single one of them. And when you're under those trees, canopies of big flat-topped acacias and monkeys, and you talk about people with pet animals. Lots of the farms that we visited had pet monkeys or pet baboons or pet duiker or impala, lion cubs. But my dad was absolutely anti any wildlife being tamed. He didn't like it. He'd grown up bushman in Africa, and I asked all the veterinary department guys in the camp to catch me a monkey, and absolutely, my father just wouldn't have it, not at all. But yeah, foot and mouth played a big part in our lives. I'll probably know more about foot and mouth than most vets in Australia.
We triggering each other's memories. At Plumtree School, it was quite wild. Plumtree's pretty far away from any other civilization, and it's right on the Botswana border. And the schoolboys obviously used to love the favorite pet was a little Huki, which is a night ape. Used to fit in your top pocket and easy to feed, and they were so cute. And so the naharapis, and a lot of schoolboys did falconry, so peregrine falcons and yellow-billed falcons and that type of thing. So and then brown house snakes and that sort of thing. And anyway, the local Africans caught on to this quite quickly, and every spring, just before school holidays, they would go out into the wild and capture as many baby animals as they could find. So you're talking about baby baboons, baby monkeys, even baby, leopards and lions and all kinds of, duiker and that type of thing. And I, like your dad, I really felt that this was something that I disapproved of. And so some piccaninnies came to the school to sell these wild animals that they'd caught in like plastic shopping bags kind of thing. And I can remember I just confiscated them and didn't pay them and gave them a kick in the backside, didn't send them on their way. Anyway, so there I arrived home. I think I had one baby monkey and I had 3 baby duiker. And my dad was quite upset with me. Why did you do this? I said, well, what if I didn't know how else, I didn't know what else to do but to try and bring them home and rescue them. The duiker, just a quick story, the duiker were very hard to feed because if you fed them cow's milk, they'd get diarrhea. It wasn't the same as duiker milk. And they got really bad, kind of amoebic dysentery, in fact, where my dad decided to try and treat it with kaolin, which is like clay powder, and he'd mix the milk with kaolin and morphine, and the kaolin and morphine would plug up their insides so that they didn't basically poo themselves to death. Two of the 3 died, but the third one managed to survive. And the little monkey, he just adopted me as his mom, and a little vervet monkey. And that same year, Dr. John Condi used to breed pedigree pointers, and his hobby was clay pigeon shooting, and he used to love shooting birds, and he had these pointers, that used to help him with his bird shooting. And that spring, I can remember as a young schoolboy, I had a, they were all exactly the same age. I had a little pedigree pointer, the dyker, and the monkey. None of them lived in the house. They were all banned from the house, and none of them were chained or anything. So the monkey lived in the tree outside the back door, and the little dyker just lived in the garden. Our garden wasn't at, we were in Chipinga. Our garden wasn't fenced in. So we were right at the edge of town. They could have just gone back into the wild, but they didn't. They hung around. And yeah, they became part of the family. It was, I mean, I could keep you here for half an hour just telling you stories about that monkey and the dyker. Yeah,
My,
but the
my
dyker and the dog became great friends. Yeah. Anyway.
we grew up with pointers. My father used to hunt. He was an avid bird hunter, and so we grew up. First gun I ever learned to use was a shotgun,
Yeah.
and we go out on a Sunday morning very, very early. Really early, and because of his job, we always had permission to shoot on farms close to Fort Vic. So we'd chuck the pointer in the back and grab the shotgun, and we'd walk through the bush in the morning, and we'd be home by lunchtime with a couple of guinea fowl Franklin. But
Yeah.
Dad, I learned to train dogs. So still, that carried that stuff. All those things we did, I think they all helped us. I grew up barefoot in the bush with a pellet gun. Shooting birds and doves, and cooking them, butchering them on the fire, with my dogs. And I recently went away with the guys here, and Jubes and I was sitting and talking, and we were discussing how I recently did a shoot. Was invited to shoot with the Rhodesians. Were invited to shoot with some Australian veterans. And we had the commandos and the SAS retired guys went and camped on one of their farms, and they had a shooting comp. And the commandos very quickly said they wanted the Rhodesians to shoot, and we ended up winning the comp with the commandos. And I remember when the commando guy said, "Oh, we'll have the Rhodesians with us." The SAS guys, these Aussie old retired SAS, and they're not that old. These guys are, Afghanistan veterans, and they go, "What, can those guys shoot or something?" Yes, we didn't grow up in suburbia like you guys. We were wandering around the bush, with pellet guns from when we were little. I'm surprised that I don't have lead poisoning from carrying the pellets in my mouth. We all did. But yeah, we that was a lifestyle that we had, and that was all impacted. It brings us to the important stuff, which is about the thing that really impacted on all of our lives and changed our lives quite dramatically was the war. And distinctly for me, it sort of happened at that time where I went from primary school or junior school to high school. And just before that, at Mbezi, my dad ended up, Unetsi Ranch swapped one of the sections of their ranch for one closer to the Unetsi River, and that sort of bordered the ranch for one at Mbezi siding with the government. And my dad he had the job of setting it up, and he used to set it up as his base in the Leifeld to go out from. So he built a couple of rondavels and a kitchen and stuff there. So we spent a lot of time at Mbezi siding. Got to know a few of the railway guys. The Glenn family, Mr. Glenn and Bobby and his son, and they, you talk about the impact of the war. I've got a photo of Bobby standing on the back of my dad's Mazda truck in about 1974, 75. Bobby went on to join the railways with his dad, Bill Glenn, who was a Scotsman. And I remember he claimed to, when I used to go and visit with my dad, he used to give me shortbread and tell me what a good shortbread cook he was. I've since touched base with his daughter, who told me it was probably her mum in Bulawayo who baked the shortbread. But they ended up being ambushed. Unfortunately for the Glenn family, Bobby and his older brother and his father, railways, they ended up working together in the railways, and there was an incident with the train. I'm not sure if the train was mined on the Vic Falls line, and the three of them and a group of railways guys bolted up the railway line to go and repair, and they got ambushed, and Bobby was wounded, and his father and his brother were both killed in that incident. And I think that incident still haunts him to this day. So they're the types of incidents that kids like us, that impacted us. My brothers, my mum and I were home. Dad was away in the bush. What a lot of people don't know, the veterinary department guys, they had a little pass that they had carried in their wallet. And if they turned up to a no-go area or a no-go and there's a roadblock and the army would turn them around, they just flashed their Department of Agriculture badge and the guys had to open the roadblock and let them through. They had a free rein. I can remember one incident my dad talked about where he went into Paquita when he was in Paquita, and things were really, really hot around Paquita towards the end of the war. And he went into a no-go zone, and I'd say the scouts were probably operating in there, and they were told not to shoot at anything. And they're inspecting cattle, and they could see, activity, so they just packed up their Land Rovers and left. He had a lot of incidents like that. His mate Reg Bront, funny stories about the war. Reg was he could be a bit bombastic with his guys that worked for him. And my dad tended to just go off in his old green Land Rover with his mate Reg Bront. It was the two of them. Reg had a bright blue Land Rover, and they were in the black soil country down near Bolly somewhere on that road, all by themselves, no escort. And the guys on the back, my dad was travelling behind Reg, and they weren't supposed to carry guys on the back, but the escorts were standing up on top of the Land Rovers, looking over the roll bars, holding their weapons, and they started yelling and shouting at Reg. And there was a big green box tank mine, and a truck had gone through, and the mud had pushed it up, and it was standing sideways with just the point sticking out of and Reg drove right over it, and it didn't detonate. The guys on the back were going off their trolley, and when he stopped his Land Rover and got out to abuse these, guys in the back, his escort, they all said, "But boss, look!" And right next to this Land Rover tyre had popped the wooden mine out, and it was sitting on the road. It had spat it right out. The mud had just spat it out. And then my dad's behind him going, "Reg, listen to the guys, don't." And some of those. Reg had another incident where one of his guys, who's had the strange name of Scumbraxen, because one morning Reg was at breakfast and he'd just got this new field orderly, and he walked in, he said, "Boss, do you want Scumbraxen for breakfast?" So Reg goes, "Well, whatever it is." It was scrambled eggs. So his nickname was Scumbraxen. So Reg took him to the range, taught him how to use a G3, and they were in Paquita again, and they came down a hill, and Reg's Land Rover backfired, and Scumbraxen let rip with the G3, and he just opened up, and he ended up sitting on Reg's lap, and he shot the shit out of the front of the Land Rover, hit a couple of magazines, and Reg's Land Rover had actually the little linkage to the carburetor got shot off. So my dad and his guys drove through, and Dad was at C Squadron SAS, so he was pretty cluey, and him and his guys sort of drove through what they thought was an ambush, and then he worked out pretty quickly that there was nothing going on, so they called a ceasefire, and worked out that it was Scumbraxen that had reacted to the backfire. Reg got out of the Land Rover, seized and confiscated the G3, and went and cut a twig off a branch and handed it to his field orderly and said, "There, you can shoot with that now."
Gosh, so many stories, eh?
Those guys, there were lots of stories about that, but the point that I was getting to was that I was at home with my mum, and we lived in Fort Vic in the rural area, so there'd been a few incidents around the rural area of Fort Vic. I think at one time the headmaster's house was taken out, and I think the car got burnt. I'm trying to remember now my memory. On the outskirts of Fort Vic, I think they fired. And then there was another attempted attack on the fuel depot in Fort Vic too, I think at some time. I got a horse in about 1977, and it must have been the end of 1977, and she was getting to the point of being broken in, and someone gave me a saddle, and things were starting to really crank up a little bit towards the end of 1977 in Fort Vic, and Dad was home, strangely enough, and that day, and we used to get a lift home to Flex Pots. And I decided I was going to go to the farmers co-op in town and get a girth for the saddle that someone had given me so I could try it on my horse. And, you know, when you're a kid, you just have to do something. And the old man said, I don't want you leaving home. He probably knew something and we didn't. There was a lot of activity around Fort Vic that day, military activity. And I rode my bicycle into the farmers co-op, you know, snuck into town without telling the old man and anybody, and bought my girth for my horse and rode on the old back road, the old strip road down the, you know, because that way no one would see me, and I crossed this bridge, and there were two alouettes going buzzing all over the place, over the top of me and around, and I went, I wonder what's going on here. And as I rode up the road, this skinny little RLI guy stood up out of the bush with an MAG, and I won't use the language that he used, but what are you doing here, you little shit? Just went to the farmer's co-op, and he goes, go that way and go quickly. And I went, oh, shit, what's going on here? So I took off and on my bicycle, and there was a stick of RLI guys all in the bush, you know, all cammed up and in hot pursuit of a group of kids. And I ended up on the main road to Kyle Dam, and my mother and our cook boy appeared over the hill in Mum's white Peugeot, you know, and there was steam coming out of my mother's ears, and she had the old man's old 38 revolver lying on her lap, and she gave me a bollocking, and Fernando was yelling at me, and jumped into the car and threw the bike in the back, and we thundered back home. And when my old man came home that night, I was in big shit. But mate of mine, Duncan Wardley, was exactly the same. Old Duncan and I, he was about 5 minutes behind me. And the RLI guys gave him an absolute, you know, caning, and I think they sent him back into town. So then, you know, stuff like that impacted us kids too. Lots of my friends, most of the kids at Fort Vic High were boarders. It was a very, very big boarding school. And all those kids, their families were all farmers or ranchers, or they came from Triangle or Cheradzee, Chatsworth, Gutu, you know, all around. And they were all boarders at our school, boys and the girls. And there were always stories, you know, the kids had come back and some of them had been, you know, houses had been hit, they'd been ambushed, a couple of them hit mines. A friend of mine, Andre Farmer, who's now passed away sadly, Andre went down to, he couldn't go home for one of his holidays, so he ended up going to Lake Kyle to the caravan park with I'm trying to think of the guys, the family that ran the place there, and they were out hunting. As you came into Lake Kyle on the left-hand side, that spot there,
yes,
and
yes.
around the back there was you know, they had the farm was part of that, and they had a little short wheelbase Land Rover, and I remember the guys, they were a couple of years older than me, and they ended up going out hunting, and they were out hunting a kudu, and next thing they had a contact with a group of girls, and there's just these three kids in a short wheelbase Land Rover with hunting rifles. But luckily for them, they took off into the bush, and they ended up getting back home safely. Another mate of mine.
Sorry, the caravan park thing. Sorry, I think it was John Gifford talked about that. The Gifford family. Does that ring a bell?
Oh, I couldn't remember. If I told you their name,
okay.
I'd be.
Sorry, Huki.
There's so many people. You know, my memory, like everybody else's. At school, the school was. I was a day scholar, so I was scum. Well, you know, I recently met. I was interesting when you talk about how we greet each other and how we identify with each other as roadies. My wife and I were traveling somewhere, and this American guy walked past me, and he passed some comment, and his wife spoke, and she's a little bit older than me, and I looked at her and I said, "You're from Rhodesia." And her husband just rolled his eyes and he goes, "Oh, now you're going to ask what school she came from." And Leanne, my wife, said that my wife and him walked off laughing, and they went, "Oh, here we go." And her and I had, and she told me what school. And the first thing, "What school did you go to?" And we always talk about that, giving Jeeves a hard time about him being a Plumtree boy, and I'm a Fort Vic boy. And when I went away with that shooting comp, one of the ex-RLI guys that was with us, he was an old guinea fowl boy. So all our schools played rugby against each other. So we all identified with, where I never really thought about it till that lady said it to me. And now every time I meet a roadie, they go, "What school did you go to?" I go, "There you go." It's very important to us what school we went to. It's our tribe, I suppose. We're quite tribal too, in a way.
Yeah.
And that's, but it was hard for my mum and I being home alone. There's a number of we're always worried that one night, fast asleep. My bedroom was right near the road, and one night I woke up and there was this god awful noise, just so, and it was vehicles, rattling and bouncing, and the screen. The Alouette had a distinctive whine, but so did those 4.5s. When you're driving one of those big Mercedes 4.5s and they slow down, they sound like an Alouette. They got the same very loud whine, and I could hear these, and I went, "That's a 4.5." And then all these lights in our backyard, and my twin brothers were in armoured cars. They were national servicemen, and they were doing a whole lot of work around Fort Vic, particularly in the Lowveld, and they're doing a lot of stuff on the road between Fort Vic and Bight Bridge. And my mum and I turned all the lights on, and next thing there's, two RLs and 4 armoured cars parked in our front yard, and I can't remember how many how many armoured car guys, but next thing the house was just filled with young guys, young hungry guys with camo, and I had to run up to wake up our cook boy Fernando, and Fernando put his white suit on and his whites on and came bolting down, and next thing the kitchen was fired right up. And I think when they left in the morning, because they all gonked everywhere, I woke up to go to school. There's just guys in camo and green sleeping bags everywhere. You could hardly walk. And then Fernando was there cooking bacon and eggs, and the poor old chickens, they were lucky that the chickens in the backyard didn't have their necks wrung if they're cooked. But the interesting thing about that, they would come and visit on a Friday. So I think they must have had a resupply Friday morning. And just funny stories. I'd get home from school and there'd be an RL and, 2 ferrets in the front yard. And, the army, every jerry can would be filled with petrol. And the guys would fill these things with so much petrol, there'd be petrol leaking out of them. And our gardener, Enoch, plastic, every bucket in the house was under these ferrets. And I went, and my brothers are going, "What are you doing, Enoch?" And he goes, "No, that's petrol for my lawnmower, man. It's free petrol." He was collecting all the petrol leaking out of all these, because they had a big, and I looked at that too as a kid, and I went, both the ferrets were towing a big bloody trailer filled with petrol, and I thought, bloody hell, what happens if they get, what happens if a tracer hits that, when they're doing their resupply? And Enoch was out there tapping the Rhodesian government fuel for his lawnmower. But it all comes back to reality too, because as a kid you wander down and you have a look at those armoured cars, and you're a kid and it's exciting. Your brother shows it to you, and then you look on the front of the armoured car and there's claret lying there, and that this shit's serious. There's some blood on the armoured car, and you just never asked. Things like that, you could see that. And my brother Colin, that call up was very, very tough for him. Those 2 guys, my twin brothers, I can remember them both at the back door in tears, with my mum and Fernando ironing their uniforms. They used to tailor their cams. because they were doing this thing 6 weeks in, 6 weeks out, 6 weeks in, 6 weeks out, all through their apprenticeship. You know, they were territorials, but they couldn't act. And there was a point there where they were more in the army than they were at David Whitehead's, where they were, you know, where they were working. And I can remember Glenn standing, you know, crying in our back veranda because he just was burning out from all of this stuff that they were putting them through. Colin and a guy called Emsley. The Emsley family were from Fort Vic too. Mrs. Emsley, I knew her. She worked in Economy Corner, which became was a shop belonged to the Richards family in Fort Vic, and she worked for the Richardses for years. Her son was, they were, you know, colours, what we used to call guffles and that. He's in armoured cars with my brother. Colin, for some reason, never really got it. I only found out recently that he never got his license. He struggled to get his military license. But what they would do with Colin and Emsley was Emsley would drive and Colin would be on a 2.5 with a 5.0 Browning. And they were bait. So the 2.5 at night and early in the morning, they would drive between Rotanga and Fort Vic, or Bite and Fort Vic, but predominantly Rotanga and Fort Vic or Tushibani on those raids at night. And they would actually be the bait. And they behind them would be the armoured cars and RLs. And they were hoping to bait a contact with the that were operating in that area. So, you know, that was pretty tough. There's a story Colin told me years later. We're sitting at Kariba having a few beers. Sadly, my brother Colin died at 47 years old. He drowned, but he was quite a soft guy. But we were sitting talking, and he was telling me they got way ahead of the rest of the group, and they pulled the 4.5 off the road somewhere in the bush, and they parked it, you know, right up next to the fence. Because remember, our roads were quite wide. You had, you know, the mowed strips on the sides, and they pulled the little 2.5 off right up against the thing. And Colin and Emsley, they'd had a bit of a brew up with their gas stove, and they were just sitting drinking a cup of tea. And Colin used to smoke, and they were just sitting there smoking, and they were leaning against the wire of the barbed wire fence. And the wire went, Colin felt the wire vibrate. And he said to Emsley, "Hey, shush, the wire's moving." So they put out their smokes and they looked. And about 100 metres, not even 100 metres up the road, a big group of Gundungas were crossing the road. And Colin said they were fully, he said they had RPDs, they had, they had RPG-7s. He said these guys were fully kitted out. And he said, he said, we just sat there. We said nothing, didn't move. And they just watched these guys and they just prayed that they didn't see them, because they would have been totally outgunned. But in the dark, just the way the vehicle was parked, obviously the dark, and it wasn't I don't know why, but something was on their side, but they weren't seen. And they watched all these cross the road, and then they waited. And next thing, all the armoured car guys arrived. So they reckons they didn't move till the cavalry arrived. They weren't going to move. So lots of stories like that we used to hear. So as a kid, there was lots of that happened to us. We saw a lot of that. I had, we collected. You think about it now, we collected lots of macabre things, and we became detuned to stuff like that. I can remember my brothers coming home, and I was always, because I was the youngest brother, and I was a bit, like all of us kids, we thought the war was great, and as a child, we were going to win this war. We were the strongest. Our soldiers, our army, our prime minister our world was Rhodesia. It was nothing, we never saw past that. And I had, lots of exploded ordnance. I had RPG sevens that had hit farmhouses. I had hand grenade fragments. I had magazines that had been shot. I actually used to have a whole bunch of AK magazines. That was the first incident where my brother Beaver had a contact and shot up a whole lot of a group of insurgents. And afterwards he recovered the magazines and the chest webbing from the guy, but the magazines were full of bullet holes, and I had them in my room for a long time, but my mother objected quite profusely to that macabre bit of stuff. So my brother Beaver and I threw out a well, and we knew where there was a well where we disposed of it. And that well, I often think about that well somewhere in Fort Vic, in rural Fort Vic, where there's a lot of white phosphorus and other ordnance at the bottom of that well.
Yeah, yeah.
Try to help anybody who ever digs into the mud at the bottom of that well one day, because it's going to be exciting.
Yeah, I think it's been, traditional for soldiers. I mean, you think of the American GIs in World War II on Okinawa, collecting Japanese, flags and samurai swords. And, I think I can remember my very first contact in Mozambique, seeing, obviously we also found suitcases full of cash. But the RLI soldiers were notorious for collecting mementos, and I remember Special Branch always used to be waiting for us when we arrived back after a contact and asking us to hand over all the stuff that we found, and so highly prized with things like AK bayonets and obviously Tokarev or Makarov pistols, and but I even saw one guy tucked into the yoke of his webbing. A record player, the turntable, of a record player. He had a speaker. He had a speaker under each arm, two speakers and a turntable that he obviously found. There was a big terrorist training camp, and they obviously had a sound system there. And he thought, I'm going to liberate this and take it back to Rhodesia. But yeah, it was crazy. And I also, when I left Salisbury to go back to South Africa in 1980, I can remember digging a hole in my backyard on the Second Street extension near the Salisbury University there, and burying a whole lot of stuff. I had little Chinese grenades which I never pulled the pin on, because some of them don't have a 40, and I didn't understand. I didn't know, you couldn't Google it in those days, and I didn't know, because some of these grenades had instant fuses. They were for like booby traps. So as soon as the pin's out, the thing goes off. So you can't rely on the fact that it's got a 4 to 5 second fuse. You pull the pin and your hand's gone. So a lot of these things, I just chucked them into the bottom of the hole and buried it. So I know exactly which apartment it is in Second Street Extension in the garden. There's a little arms cache there, RPG-7 rocket and rocket launcher, AK magazines and fragmentation grenades, and oh my word, yeah, I know what you're talking about.
But I think there's still a bit of that going on over there, because I've got a contact over there and he is telling me some of the stuff that I've seen that he's shown me. There's still some stuff that's available there, but we were avid collectors, us kids.
Yeah.
And we used to take stuff to school. Bullet collection was the big one. We all used to collect bullets, and we all just had all the standard bullets. But I was lucky because my dad had a friend called Dave Marulia, and when he found out I was collecting bullets, strange to how your brain thinks as a kid. My dad turned up one day with this cardboard box, and he went, "Dave Marulia's given you this." And I said, "What is it?" And he said, "It's his bullet collection." And there must have been 500-600 different bullets in it. And they were really good, because what Dave had done is he got a little hand drill and he drilled a little hole in the side and emptied all the powder out of them. But there was a bullet out of a hunter, with
Sure.
obviously a training round that had been fired and put back in the brass. There was, of course, I had 20 mil.
Yeah,
You know,
from Beaver.
from a K car, that was, but always, Beaver never gave me anything that hadn't been
Oh,
through the Force armourer. And I actually had a Sneb rocket.
sure.
That was nice. And the armourers the Air Force armourers had made it completely inert. Like, I
Yeah,
wish I
yeah,
knew where it was now, because the tube was empty, so there was nothing in the rocket tube. And the HE head you could unscrew where the fuse wasn't there. But I used to love smell. I used to unscrew it to all my mates. I used to go, yeah, smell. You could smell it. We used to sniff the explosive. I don't know what was in there. I wonder why we have chemical poisoning.
I
My
remember
brother.
when I was doing my SAS training, we had to work with explosives, and we had this stuff called PE808, which plastic explosive, and it had fumes that used to give you a migraine headache every time you
Yes.
worked with
No,
it.
no, if you touch it, doesn't it also give you a headache? You got to wear gloves. I'm
Yeah,
pretty
no, we never wore gloves. Yeah,
sure there was no such thing as safety there in that sense. But different things, different incidents that happened. My mate and I, one of the teachers we had, you talked about falconry. There was a teacher we had at Fort Vic High, Roy Teague, and Roy used to be into falconry and pointers, and he opened a shooting club with the school. And of course, we all turned up. And what did kids turn up with SLRs, FNs? That was our shooting club. And because we lived in the plots, my mate Duncan Wardley and I, we just walked through the bush to the rifle range. And the teacher's going, "Where did you guys come from?" So, "Oh, we just walked, yes, sir." "With those rifles?" "Yes, sir." "Oh, okay." FN's over, old man's SLR. And on the way back, the school bus had gone, and we're at the small range. We walked across the big range at Fort Vic, and we were just standing there, and there was no one there. It was deserted. So, we had a little private shooting competition, my mate Duncan and I, and we were naughty little buggers. And then we decided, hey, let's go and check what exploded ordnance there is behind the range. And we're just about to climb over the back of the range, and there's a Gormor behind it, and start looking, not thinking that there could be unexploded ordnance, and the police, SB Land Rover pulled up, and the guys come here. So we wandered down. He goes, "What are you guys doing now with rifles?" I said, "Oh, we just did the school shooting thing." And he had one of those Russian submachine guns, or Chinese, with a drum on the top, little, with a cooling fins on the barrel. What are they called? I'm trying to think of the name of it. You know what I mean? A real rubbish thing. So then he showed it to us. Typical Rhodesia. He's the SB policeman, but because we were interested in this gun, he showed it to us, and then he goes, "Oh, I got to fire the thing. Just stand over there, boys, by the Land Rover." And every time he fired it, the drum would fall off, because cheap Chinese rubbish. And eventually he got it to fire. Then "Come on, boys, have a shot." So he gave us the shot, and then he goes, "Now, don't go behind them because you'll hurt yourselves, bugger off home." So stuff like that. You think about the kids today, and what we did, and we were trusted to walk around with our fence.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Then the war really warmed up. Things got pretty tough, and once, around about the time the Muzarewa government came into power, as you know, we all thought the war would cool down, but it really fired up, and we started to get very short of manpower. There was a guy in Fort Vic, Inspector Norchi, and I used to kick around with his kids. He had a couple of daughters. I think his daughter was in the police. Hugh was about my age, and he had a younger son called Garth. And he was in Partu and all sorts of stuff in Fort Vic. But he's a bit of a forward thinker, old Norchi. He started a police medic team through the Women's Police Reserve, and they had a Land Rover that was fully set up, and they used to help the ambulance with major accidents and stuff. And he got us kids involved at school. And we went and did this medic course with Norche. There's a group of about 6 of us kids that went and did it. And it was a military first aid course. We did everything. We did vehicle extractions. Our exam at the end was full. We were allowed to give drugs. We learnt all about morphine. We were given drips to go home and practice giving ourselves drips. So as 15-year-old kids, and we're giving ourselves drips. I practiced on our gardener, and then my dad said to me, "I don't think you should be doing that. If something goes wrong." So I stopped using our gardener as a wounded practice.
Yeah.
And what that led to was there was a group of Dad's Army guys that would go around our rural area at night. And what they do is they'd grab a convoy Mazda, and they had a roster, and they would do patrols of the rural area at night. And Norche saw in Salisbury there'd been a BSAP guy that had got permission to attest 16-year-old schoolboys in to Dad's Army, and they were doing it they did it as a trial in Salisbury. And Inspector Norche, being Inspector Norche, I don't know how he did it with the powers that be, or whether he actually even had permission. To this day, I don't know. But once we got our parents' permission, there was a whole group of us kids from Footvic High who actually went and did all this training, issued uniforms, and we were police special reservists. And we all ditched our blue overalls, and we were told to scrounge camo from wherever we can. And I ended up in the vehicle with a guy called Hardy Henning, who ran. He was in charge of it. He was the boss of Dad's Army, and his son was in the RLI. I think he was an officer, and he turned up at my house one night because one Saturday night someone had said they didn't want to come. So Hardy turned up at our house and asked he said I was always keen, and threw me a pair of brand new camo and said, "Come on out with me, my boy." And off I went. And because I was good on the radio, that was it. He became my boss, and I was always on the vehicle with Hardy Henning. And it was good because then I only did Saturdays, because all my mates were doing. We would start at about just after dark, 7, 8 o'clock at night, and we'd go till about 2 or 3 in the morning, because the vehicles then had to be prepared for, I think, the convoy. The guys from the convoys would start at about 4 in the morning, so we couldn't keep the vehicle going all night. And we would patrol around. We were each issued with a personal weapon, and then we also had the 303 Browning in machine gun up in the turret. And it was cold in that thing in winter, I can tell you, especially when the Guti weather hit. And I had a couple of interesting nights with that. Well, I had one night where the local police reserve were hitting a few of the villages around close to the plots, and they called us in as backup. So that was interesting as a kid, because we just sort of drove up with a Mazda, and we would just give them a bit of, because we 3 other guys, and we also had the Browning. I think they probably felt a bit more comfortable having us with a turret, the Mazda just sitting off there if they needed it, and they're doing village clearing and searching for Majibas. That was an interesting night to see that stuff happen. Saw a couple. I was involved in a couple of those, and always felt very uncomfortable with them, because you just didn't know who was who. And I felt for and as you've probably done it yourself, but I really felt for the police reserve guys that had to clear those huts in the dark at night, because they didn't know where you could inspect anything. Thank God, we never encountered anything. We had another incident one night where the Stopover restaurant on the way to Fort Vic on the way to Lake Kyle, there's a restaurant service station, been there forever. It's called the Stopover, and the old strip road runs through there, and it's the intersection where the old strip road takes off towards Bight Bridge, and the other road goes on towards Kyle Dam. And it was a real hotbed. The Stopover was always getting taken out at night by insurgents, constantly. And there was a big group there, and one of the insurgents that was in that area was pretty switched on apparently, and they were hunting for him. Our call sign, by the way, was Delta Zulu 6. So, and I used to call up the guys up on one of the gomos. There was a OP up on one of the gomos, and I think they were called Delta Zulu. I can't remember. But if those guys see this, they'll probably remember me, because I always used to call them up and have a bit of a chat to them, because they were stuck on top of a hill, all by themselves. One night we were called into the stopover because there was some shots fired there, and locals were a bit nervous. So we were tasked by sent by the police station in town to go out and have a look. And I thought, oh, this is going to be on. And I think we'd gone about a K, and we got a radio call to stand down, and we were ordered to return to Fort Vic, to Central, to the police station. And when we went in, we were sent home. Vehicle was taken from us. And what we heard, the debrief we heard later on, was this guy the army had turned up, and there was a massive contact. What had happened was the idea was to lure us in and take us out. They wanted to take out the Mazda. But thank goodness there was some intel, and we were called off. Or maybe one of the hierarchy thought, no, let's not send a 16-year-old and two 65-year-old men into a red hot incident. We'd rather send the army.
Sure.
We were quite relieved when we found out afterwards, because that wouldn't have been very pleasant for us at all.
Just something that's question I have, Huki, is so you learned radio voice procedure and phonetic alphabet and all that kind of stuff?
Yeah.
Okay. What did you have? Little A63s, or did you
I think so.
Yeah,
it was whatever the convoy Mazda had. That was the only comms we had. Was okay. that little radio inside the vehicle?
Did it had a handset, or
a little handset? Yeah, as a mic.
Okay.
And I can't remember. And I was trying to think if it was the same as the one that was in the Land Rovers, but it had the steel whip. So I don't know if they were VHF. They never went into the. Nowadays, I think about it, I don't know what the police used for local comms.
Yeah, that'd be. Gosh. Yeah, it's interesting stuff that we did when we were 16 years old. I can remember I left school. I think I was 16 when I left school with my O-levels, and then I got a job with the Chipinga cheese factory, Gazaland cheese factory, and I had to deliver milk and cheese to the farmers in the Sabi Valley, at the Sabi irrigation scheme, and I had a black helper, and I had like a bakkie with a refrigerated bakkie like container at the back. And at the age of, because we all got our driver's licenses at the age of 16 in Rhodesia. So I was driving down to, from Chipinga down past the Malseta turnoff and down into the Sabi Valley and delivering milk and cheese. And then we occasionally drive all the way down towards Chizimbunji. And there was a hot spring there that had swimming pool that had completely deserted. And we used to buy a couple of quarts of beer from the local store, cold beer, and this black guy and I used to lie there. I was unarmed, and it was a bit of a hot area in those days. But I used to lie in this swimming pool in this hot spring, drinking cold beer, and oh man, what a life! And then at the age of 17, I was called up, and the rest is history, as they say. But yeah, the war wasn't nearly as hot then as it was when you were growing up in Rhodesia. Yeah. So
well, the other thing too that was really interesting for me was when Beaver was right towards the end of the war. Beaver was he was actually stationed in Fort Vic, and one of my twin brothers, Glenn, had decided in army he wanted to be a medic, and Glenn he was a good medic, but he pulled out of it and he went back to being in armoured cars. And he was based in Fort Vic too. It was really interesting because Beaver would come home a couple of times during the week, and so would Glenn, and they'd tell stories. And there were stories of, Glenn would say, Beaver would have contacts with the insurgents, and then they'd come in and Glenn would be patching them up before they went to hospital, and they're captive. Fort Vic High, the hospital was right there. My mate and I used to stand on the end of one of the blocks at school, and we used to watch the choppers practicing and flying at Fort Vic Airport. The other thing that we saw a lot of was right near one of the hostels where the choppers used to come in with the Kazovacs. We used to, it was near the hockey fields. We'd land and we'd see them taking the guys in, whoever. And my mate and I, we used to run up there. And I've written something about it in Mimi's book, where I describe what we saw when they're hosing the chopper out and stuff like that. And then eventually the school stopped us. It became out of bounds for that reason, because we'd all run up and stand next to the fence, and there were wounded guys and people going into hospital. Sometimes they weren't wounded, sometimes they were deceased, and I think the school decided that that wasn't good for the kids to be there, so that was made out of bounds for us to do that. My dad used to travel a lot. Beaver took some time off and spent a lot of time in the bush with him. I always wanted to go with him, but I would ride escort for him only if he's going to Gutu or something like that. The veterinary department had guns, with full armory and SLRs and stuff. And there was a really short FN in there. It was metal, really old rifle. Never seen one like it since or after that. Even the forestock was like a grey, was quite old. It had almost gone silver. All the bluing had gone silver. And it didn't even have a flash eliminator or muzzle brake on the end of it. It was just had a clean barrel on this short little FN. And whenever my dad went to the veterinary department and I rode escort for him, that was my favourite because it was a nice light little FN, and I'd ride shotgun with him with that if he went to Gutu or something. But it was good fun. If they went to the range to test their weapons, we always went with. So we were all of us were proficient, and anyone who came around to my house, I think when the army guys used to turn up and they had their weapons there, they loved me because it didn't matter if there were 10 FNs in the house, I cleaned them all for them before they left. just very proficient at it, as we all were.
Sure.
Beaver used to fly over the house when we were home sometimes. That was an interesting experience, very moving. Very exciting when you hear the chopper coming, and we'd run out onto the front lawn and we'd all wave and he'd, orbit the house. And what I'm talking about, the sound, that sound when they're that close to you, those choppers, you can't even hear yourself thinking, the vibration goes right through you, and the rotor wash and stuff, and he'd be hanging out the window waving at us. And but the worst thing was watching that chopper turn and fly away.
Yeah.
That didn't just sit. Just my mum and I would just stand there for hours until it disappeared in the distance. Because even though they were probably just shuttling to Buffalo Range or somewhere else, you just knew that we never knew if that was the last time we'd see him. And eventually, my dad put a stop to it. My father actually pulled Beaver aside and said, "Stop doing that." He said, "You're just giving people." We could become a target because of that. So my father stopped it. I mean, who knows? The other thing that I can remember was when the guys would come to the house. When Beaver was based in Fort Vic, I think one of those trips was when they were trialling the Dalmatian on the G car, which was the 4 Brownings, and he was one of the gunners on those. He did a lot of work with Andre Dennison and the RAR guys. Some of the RAR guys were from Fort Vic High. So I'm trying to think of the guy's name. There was one of the young officers I went to school with him. He's only a couple of years ahead of me. RAR had the key to the city, and we watched them. I can still remember they had a big open day. The RAR marched through town. Us kids all climbed up on top of Julie's and watched them march through from that. And I think I've still got a little badge from that day. When the guys used to come and visit us, I can remember when some of the guys who turned up and our braais that I know were there. My dad we fed a lot of guys, and it was every other night. Our braai place was full of Air Force guys, and I can remember some of those guys wore very new camouflage, and they had Afrikaans accents. And a lot of people didn't know. I wasn't even allowed to tell my school friends, but I could identify who a helicopter belonged to by the camouflage pattern on the helicopter.
Oh, right.
Yeah. So some of them were South African. People don't know that, but I can pick it. I even look in photos now, and I can go South African chop, Asian chop.
Yeah. It's funny you should bring up Andre Dennison. It's November the 11th. It's just around the corner, Remembrance Day. I know you Australians take remembrance very seriously, which is nice. And I'd like to start a new series. We've done the Fighting Men of Rhodesia quite extensively, but I'd like to start a new series going through the roles of honor and having soldiers not talk so much about themselves, but rather to bring to life some of the names on those roles of honor. And I thought that would be because a lot of guys are reluctant to talk about their own experiences, but they may be a little bit more willing to talk about guys that they knew, and there's also a depressingly long roll of names of all the commercial farmers that were killed. So I've had a lot of support for the idea. Guys like Jerry Strong, and I think I'm gonna kick off the first episode with Russell Fulton. Don Price and all these guys have lent their support. But what I'd like to do, just as we brought some of the soldiers and some of the different units to light in Fighting Men of Rhodesia, I'd like to bring the Australian, one of the war memorials, or the main war memorial in Sydney or wherever it is, I don't know, but have recently done an initiative where they've included audio. So as you walk through, like all the guys who died at Gallipoli or whatever,
if you ever get a chance,
they got teenage or they got schoolgirls to read out the names. You know what I'm talking about? Yeah. So as you go and look down the names, some schoolgirl who's maybe the same age as the guy who died at Gallipoli, reading out his name, and it just, in a weird way, it rather than just a cold name on a plinth somewhere, in a weird way, it brings that name to life, and you realize, geez, this guy was only 18 years old,
You get a couple of young guys from Africa with the right accent, and it'll be chilling.
Yeah.
Have you seen have you watched or listened to the podcast, The Warrior Next Door, the American podcast?
I will look it up. Yeah.
There's a guy called Ray Harris Jr., and he does a podcast called The History of World War II. It is dead set the best podcast. There must be 10,000 podcasts now, but he's awesome. And all these people come on and do. They do.
Is it just audio?
It's just audio. It's you wanted The Warrior Next Door, man. They go and talk to. It started off with warrior people. A lot of the guys in World War II never spoke. They didn't talk about what they did.
Yeah.
Some of these guys are only talking the first time to these two guys that are just interested. That you got to get into The Warrior Next Door and listen to the story.
Okay, I will.
You'll love it, and it might give you some ideas. Their questioning is very good to how they interview. Talking about those South African guys that came to the house, we became very, very good. I became very good friends with them, and some of them gave me. I've still got one of their patches, but when they pulled out, there was a point when the South Africans, that was it. And Beaver said to my mum and I, just be home on a certain day. And he was really upset when those guys left. And I think that from a kid's point of view, that was the day I knew that it was over for us, because like I was standing in our backyard on our plot, because I went to a big open area, and the whole squadron, every single Alouette that belonged to South Africa did a fly past over our house, because all of those guys on their way back, all those guys as a tribute to my mum and dad. But my dad wasn't there, it's just my mum and I. And to this day, I can still remember standing in my backyard and having that formation of choppers. And man, I've never seen alouettes fly so fast in my life. I have never seen, and they were low. Then Beaver writes in his book about the whistle of the rotors with the trees as the choppers go. Those choppers were that low over our house. They just whistled. They were that low, and they all just came. In the distance, we watched them coming. The sky was just full of alouettes, and they just came, and they dived down and right over, and they were treetop level over our house, and they just and they were gone like that, and there was just dead silence. And I turned around and I watched them, and that was an incredible feeling for me, a moment that I'll never forget.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Huki, on that note, thank you so much, brother. It's been very, very interesting. And I really look forward to publishing this. Thank you very much.
Just one thing, John, that I can say. I see a lot of stuff from the guys, and one thing I always say to you guys who fought, never think you never fought for nothing, because kids like us, we have a future, and I've got kids and a family, and all the guys who died and sacrificed their lives, it wasn't for nothing. You guys were doing it for us, for our generation and the younger ones, because that's what it's for. So
Thanks,
thanks.
Huki.
Cheers, though.